I'm Mangino. Thank you very much for tuning in to KDKA Radio. We have been able to make contact. Jonathan Sacerdoti joining us. He is a British journalist, broadcaster who has recently been in Israel. This man has been reporting on Israel and how they've been dealing with COVID-19. And there's an article in Business Insider that details this. Jonathan, welcome to KDKA. I appreciate you making time for us. Your reporting on the Delta variant in Israel is rather interesting to me. What have you learned?
Israel's been extremely successful in its vaccination program. That's been for a number of reasons. One of them is that it's quite a small country in terms of its population. We're talking under 10 million people. But the other is that the former Prime Minister now, Benjamin Netanyahu, managed to do a good deal with Pfizer and basically managed to get his hands on enough Pfizer vaccines to do the whole vaccination program very quickly in return for providing Pfizer with a lot of real-time data, which I think got them to the front of the queue with Pfizer, as well as just paying above the odds for the individual vaccines. However, having effectively cleared the threat of COVID away using the Pfizer vaccine so successfully, Israel is now beginning to reintroduce some restrictions again, most notably mask wearing in public indoor spaces. And that's because when I got here at the end of May for this most recent visit, I can tell you it was like stepping from the UK into not just another country, but another year. It felt like 2018. Nobody talked about COVID. Nobody was keeping their distance from each other. There was no hand gel anywhere. Not a single person was wearing a mask. Those got dropped. Compulsory mask wearing got dropped on my second or third day here. And it really seemed like the promised land in more than one sense. This was over. Mm-hmm. I saw what it looked like to live in a post-COVID era. But then within about 3 weeks, as I said, the Delta variant started to show itself in the country. And though the numbers are still very small, they are rising at a rate that's making them alarmed. And that's why they're now very keen to try and keep a lid on that spread.
And they're beginning to talk more and more about the idea of vaccinating even younger children. My understanding is that the 12 to 15, 16, 17-year-olds are able to be vaccinated, and there's a greater push to get more of them vaccinated for the sake of the older population they may be going home to every day.
Well, that's absolutely right. So Israel, again, in terms of the vaccine, has been very forward-thinking in that respect. Because the vaccine has been tried on children above the age of 12, Israel decided to start vaccinating that group. Obviously, all vaccination is voluntary. Nobody is forced to have a vaccine. But because of this recent increase in the Delta variant cases, there's been something of a push to get that younger generation vaccinated when perhaps some parents were reluctant at first to do it. Plenty did take up the offer. Others, like a mother I spoke to here in the town, Binyamina, where the latest outbreak really started, or at least was first registered, she was saying that her 13-year-old had COVID about a year before. And so having recovered, and obviously at his age it doesn't really affect you too badly usually, she felt that he didn't need to have a vaccine because he'd have had natural antibodies. But now she said she was thinking of getting vaccinated because even in those cases it gives you a boost of immunity. And similarly, I think one of the incentives for many parents is that as things like quarantine might be reintroduced when people come into contact with positive cases, it will allow those families where the children have been vaccinated, if they come into contact with someone in their school who's positive, well, the whole family won't have to quarantine because vaccinated people currently are not subject to the same quarantine rules as the unvaccinated. So it's a mixture of getting kids to have the vaccine so that you're protecting older people in the community, but also perhaps some people doing it out of just practical considerations, like not wanting too much disruption to their lives.
Two things that you wrote about. One, there are upwards of 13,000 students and teachers that are now in quarantine. And the growing concern is that the vaccine from Pfizer, effective when it comes to preventing hospitalizations, it's the issue of transmission that it doesn't seem to have the same equal strength for. And that's the real concern for community spread and those who are still unvaccinated then. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right. I think that the so-called Delta variant, which in the UK we were calling the Indian variant for a while, because that's where it was sort of first registered in massive numbers, is something that's been making a lot of people nervous. Even countries like Israel and the UK, which have quite similar vaccination rates now, the UK having caught up quite effectively with Israel, with a much bigger population. Obviously, there's this phenomenon that cases are still rising and rising faster and faster in both countries. But what they're both also keeping an eye on is not just the number of cases, but the number of what they call serious cases. That's people in hospital with serious or even life-threatening symptoms. Those numbers aren't rising at the same rate in either Israel or the UK. They are rising a bit here in Israel. So, for example, there have been 6 more serious cases when there were, I think, 518 new cases on Thursday. So that means that they're looking very carefully to see if the transmissibility is simply increased, but not the bad effects of having the virus. And if that's the case, it might be a sign that actually the vaccine's working very well. Because what it would mean is if the vaccine doesn't stop you getting COVID, it's at least stopping you getting very ill from COVID. And there are many who are now pointing to what's going on in the UK, saying that it seems that in lifting all the restrictions on July the 19th, which is currently what the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is promising, the UK might be jumping the gun a bit because they haven't finished vaccinating enough people, in the opinion of some scientists. But some are suggesting that perhaps there's a sort of covert government policy to allow this Delta variant to spread around those who've not been vaccinated, because most of the vulnerable and old have been vaccinated now. And thus, perhaps if they allow it to spread around the younger people who are less likely to get as seriously ill, that will help spread antibodies in a non-vaccine related way. Of course, that's quite a high-risk strategy, especially when you think of the complications of so-called long COVID going forward, with some statistics showing that maybe around a third of people get this long COVID in the future, and the vaccine isn't known necessarily to stop that happening.
Jonathan, I have 2 minutes here. You wrote about a couple of people who are concerned about the possibility of reintroducing a lockdown in Israel. Is there any kind of talk amongst government officials that is a possibility that is being looked at?
It isn't really a serious possibility at this stage, and I think that, like all countries, lockdowns are hopefully a thing of the past here. I think that was a very strong reaction to a very, very severe emergency in the world. But now we do have these vaccines. I think the intention is to use them strategically. And also the other thing that they're doing in Israel to try to stop there needing to be any of those sorts of measures is putting in very strong measures in the airport, because that's where the Delta variant got back in. So they're putting in 24-hour quarantine for any people coming into the country, including even vaccinated Israelis who've flown out and come back. They're up to 24 hours in quarantine until they get the result of the COVID test they have on landing in the airport itself. So there'll be mass testing in the airport of all incoming passengers, including Israelis, strict regulations on where they can travel to, mask wearing, and hopefully increased vaccination going forward. And they're hoping that will stop them needing to have things like lockdowns again.
I am sure the entire Western world will be paying attention to see how Israel handles the Delta variant and what happens there, and then what it could foretell for all of Western Europe and, of course, here in the U.S. as well. Jonathan Sacerdote joining us. He's a British journalist and broadcaster, and if you want to see the story that he did on this that we're talking about, it's at Business Insider, available on their webpage. Jonathan, thank you very much for your time. Do appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.